if you're here in the morning, you notice that Rolake has changed. She had a wardrobe change because you can't wear the same dress twice, right? On the same day, who does that? I also had to do a wardrobe change and get a jacket on just to make sure we're on the same level. And how you know somebody's a big deal, you start to type the name on Google and you get a suggestion. And I started to type this morning, Rolake, so I was like R-O-L, and the first name that came up was Rolake. I was like, okay, Rolake Akinkugbe, okay, I get it. She's a big deal. If you've not met her, she's the VP and Head of Energy and Natural Resources Coverage and Origination at FBN Capital. She's a specialist and professional if you're talking anything to do with energy and natural resources in Africa, investment banking. She covers global oil, gas, energy, mining and metals industries, the market fundamentals, upstream, downstream, the oil economics, all of those things. She's an expert in that, and we're so glad to have her come and just speak a little more extensively about natural resources in Africa, the energy sector, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges in there. You have experience in Nigeria trying to broker deals and looking through all of Africa. She was telling me about a specific story in Kenya, in one part of the country that anybody outside the country wouldn't know about. So really she does know her stuff. And I just want to start off by giving you about 10 minutes to give us a sort of a high level overview of what you'll be talking about. Then I'll ask a few questions and open it up to the audience as well. Please give her a big round of applause as she starts off.
First of all, I wanted to say, Larry, I'm going to get you back about that wardrobe change comment. But let me just start by thanking Mariam. Really, really grateful to have this opportunity and platform. I mean, I listened earlier today to Edna from Somaliland, and she, for me, is an inspiration. I just really feel privileged to have this opportunity of this platform as well. But just to give you a bit of background, I'm Nigerian. I was born and bred in Nigeria and left Nigeria at the end of high school. Came here to the UK and stayed for about 17 years. Eventually woke up and saw the light and went back to Africa in May earlier this year. I've had a very sort of interesting and perhaps eclectic career trajectory because I started my early career in the sort of not-for-profit sector, and I've ended up as an investment banker. But I've had the privilege of living and working and traveling all over Africa. I lived in Senegal, in Dakar, in Mermoz. I was working for the International Crisis Group, and in the early part of my career, I actually thought I wanted to go into, become a diplomat, work in international conflict resolution. But that was really where my sort of love for all issues around natural resources developed, primarily because, we live and work, those of us who've moved back home, on a continent that's so blessed and so endowed. Name it. And it's not just the oil and gas and the ones we're familiar with, the diamonds and the conflict diamonds, but you have things like phosphates, potassium, uranium, cobalt, copper. There's a whole tantalite, there's a whole spectrum of resources. And it's really been very instructive coming from one side of the fence where I've worked on development and conflict issues and now working on the sort of private sector side of the fence and having had the benefit of both sides. In terms of where Africa fits into the entire picture, okay, so 10% of global oil and gas supplies come out of the continent. Around another 9%, 10% of the world's, I would say, iron ore reserves, probably the largest deposit of iron ore, the last remaining deposit of iron ore is in Simandou in Guinea's region. So we're facing a continent where we produce all these metals and minerals and oil, but we also import around 70% of the consumption or the processed and finished consumption of a lot of these minerals and materials. Classic case, Angola and Nigeria, who are the two largest producers of oil in sub-Saharan Africa. Between them, they probably have about 50 billion in hydrocarbons reserves. But Nigeria imports almost 80% of refined petroleum products that she consumes and that she needs to drive her economy. In Angola as well, there's just about one functioning refinery. I earlier gave the example of Botswana, who after many years of successfully managing what is quite a prominent diamond sector, had only its first diamond cutting and processing factory located there only a few years back. So the real question is, where is the future for Africa from the natural resources that Africa produces? In terms of the global context, one of the biggest trends that's happening now is that a lot of Africa's export markets for minerals and oil and gas are shifting. Those of you who are aware of shale oil and gas production, and essentially that's unconventional oil and gas production, will know that the United States is no longer importing crude oil and gas from West Africa. Did we know that? When I was in university in the early 2000s, I remember a lot of the talk and rhetoric at that time as, giving sort of what then was sort of my intellectual sort of knowledge about Africa was that, by the year 2025, the US would be importing around 25% of its hydrocarbon needs from West Africa. Now it's actually importing zero. Why? Because the US is a major exporter of these hydrocarbons. And then you go to the east as well. African countries are thinking, let's focus all our resources in servicing the demands of the east. But let's not forget that on the continent, we have around 300 million people who are classed as Africa's middle class. And we'll debate again whether that is a really sound classification. But the point is, there is enough consumption to absorb all of what Africa produces. But we have a missing link, and that is infrastructure. And the other perception that the natural resources industry has suffered from is the idea that the oil sector, the mining sector don't work for the ordinary man. And it's a real uphill struggle trying to shift that. So this idea that these industries are enclaves. You have huge swaths of copper and cobalt deposits in southeastern DRC in the Katanga province, but how much of that is actually fed through to finished products? And just to give you an example of some of the government policies that many of the countries are coming up with now, I know the DRC at one time introduced policies to make sure that a lot of the processing and refining of the minerals took place in the country. Zimbabwe also introduced those sorts of policies. But even with those policies happening, we're still not seeing that change. Why do we have huge environmental lobbies? Why do we have huge development lobbies lobbying the oil and gas industry, lobbying the mining industries in these countries? Is there a significant disconnect in the contracts that are being signed? Why are Chinese workers being procured for large-scale infrastructure and mining projects in Tanzania, when Africans should be able to fill those roles and should be able to fulfill those requirements? So these are the sorts of issues I'm dealing with on a daily basis. These are the sorts of issues I'm extremely passionate about. And I'm happy to talk along those issues and answer questions along those issues.
What is the kind of regulatory environment around this? For instance, something that has always fascinated me, there was this huge outrage about the BP oil spill in the US. And yet this, maybe not at the same scale, but there's oil spills all the time in and around Nigeria and some of these areas that produce oil in Africa, and you don't see the compensation, you don't see the outrage and the follow-up that comes on if you had the similar case in a Western environment.
Yeah, interesting question. And perhaps if I directly answer that, one of the features of the natural resource environment is that because of the huge amount of revenues, you have countries who 85 to 90% of their foreign exchange is coming from just oil and gas, or it's coming from gold, or it's coming from diamond exports. You develop what I call a political economy around these industries, where historically governments have felt less of a need to tax the general population, because the essential de facto source of revenue has been from a very small pool, a very small elite circle of individuals who are in a position to appropriate the proceeds and the rent, seek economic rent for a lot of these produce. So when it comes to negotiating contracts, when it comes to negotiating deals or agreements, they're highly skewed, either one, in favor of the foreign investor or in favor of a very small inner circle of people within the government apparatus that control these resources. So when it comes to environmental considerations around what I call the social license, and this is a particular feature of a lot of the deals that are signed with Eastern stakeholders from the East. A lot of the deals, for instance, signed with investors from China often take into account the political license. So the idea that China has the state-backed machinery to do deals at a government level, but actually when it then comes to working on a community level, this social license is absolutely missing. And that trickles down into hundreds and hundreds of local contexts. And I'll give a very interesting example. In 2008, I made my very first trip to Nigeria's Niger Delta. All of those of you who might be familiar with the Niger Delta and sort of the stories of militancy, insecurity, and crude oil theft. And part of that, I was part of a team that was doing what we call a project risk assessment. And when you do these project risk assessments, you talk to community leaders, you talk to the security personnel, you talk to community liaison officers and members of the oil company. And I was amongst a group of other consultants. I was the only local, by the way, at least the only national, because I wasn't local to the particular environment. And I was in a group of other consultants. And we were taking to what was the community leaders' house. And they were the youth group, actually. And if anyone knows, youth in Africa can be anywhere up to the age of 45.
Even 50.
Okay. But it's interesting, those classifications. We're taken to the house of the youth leader. And what I had heard a lot was about how these oil companies are coming to the land and they're sort of hemorrhaging Africa and they're not providing the utilities and the electricity and the boreholes and, you know, the usual stuff. And I was stunned because I entered what was a hut, which on the outside, but as soon as I walked in, what I saw was this really decked out pad, you know, with flat plasma screen TVs. And here was I talking to a youth leader who was angered at the fact that the international oil companies weren't awarding right contracts around jobs or various services. But here was a youth leader who in his very own local context was also in some way also reflecting what we see at the national level. And so it raised a question in my mind as to whether this governance issue around natural resources just triggers a cycle, what I would call a vicious cycle of an autocratic vicious cycle whereby those in positions of power, when it comes to natural resources, feel the need to appropriate those resources and distribute them according to either ethnic ties or ties according to sort of villages or whatever part of the country they come from. So it's a major challenge. And the truth is, in terms of Africa's relations with the rest of the world, a Chinese government or Norwegian government or a British government is not going to come and negotiate a contract entirely in favor of the local or national economic development. They will support sustainable governance and sustainable policies, but the onus is really on the African governments themselves to negotiate this contract from a position of strength. Now, you'll probably ask me, how do we go about doing that?
Exactly. Because the other thing that's related to that, and I was going to ask you, is these industries by design, natural resources, the extractive industries as a whole, has very little local involvement, regardless of where it is, Angola, Nigeria, because the capital required to start is so high. So naturally the foreign companies come in and they have very little local involvement. And if there is, it's in not non-skilled labor, breadcrumbs as it were. All of the expertise, all of the skills come from foreigners, and they may be in a local community, but with very little involvement in there, even in terms of any sort of environmental concerns, any sort of being mindful to that community that they're in. And how do you fix that?
I'll give you the example of your own country. So Kenya is potentially going to be a new oil producer over the next couple of years. Let's not forget it also already has a thriving soft commodity sector, a thriving agricultural sector. Now, the cost to drill a single well of crude oil offshore Kenya or in the Turkana region, the typical in frontier markets costs around $100 million for single well drilling. Now, the companies globally that have this capabilities are oil service companies like your Schlumbergers, Weatherfords, Baker Hughes. Do you know of any local Kenyan companies that have that capability today? So if you were Kenyatta's government and you wanted to introduce a local content policy whereby you gave local Kenyan companies a say or access to a contract to drill, where would you start from? You know, that is a major challenge. So in my mind, I think for the new producers, for those who are just coming into the market, you have the examples, you have your Angola, your Nigeria, those countries established, they've gone through their own uphill struggles in terms of establishing hydrocarbons industries. There's what we call the obsolescence bargaining. At the early stages, you probably will have no choice but to hire foreign expertise.
Absolutely.
That is the fact. And in any case, you need some sort of skills transfer. Nigeria has a local content policy, and when we often think about local content policy, we often think in terms of hiring people who are local, but it goes beyond that. It's also about the local value chain. One of the things that Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania can experiment with, and I'm sure some of them are doing that, is over and beyond hiring a local company like Schlumberger, which probably doesn't exist locally, is why not thinking about creating smaller scale industries around the oil and gas field site or around the mining site, who can service, who can provide land clearing services, who can provide health and safety services, catering services to the industry as a way of building local expertise. And earlier today, I also gave the example of the Ugandan government, who is exploring with visa issuance for foreign workers, where at the stage of application for your visa, you actually have to submit a succession plan as part of the criteria for meeting that. So it's not an easy road. The other thing is, and one which I often sort of talk about, is in the 60s and 50s, and I'll take the example of my own country, Nigeria. Nigeria had the thriving agricultural sector, which was you could argue was the bread basket for West Africa. I mean, northern Nigeria now, which is one of the most impoverished countries, regions in the country, used to be the bread basket for the rest of the region. In eastern Nigeria, you had a thriving palm oil sector that was exporting to other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The oil boom happened in 1957 with the first discovery at Oloibiri, and there was this huge migration pull towards the capital, so towards the coastal parts of the country. So people came from the hinterland, they came from the north, all seeking jobs. Every graduate wanted to work in oil and gas. Agriculture was decimated. Now governments, perhaps it's too little too late, are scrambling to figure out how we've built these economies that are so reliant on natural resources. How can we translate that into more productive sectors which actually employ and use larger pools of capital? Around 70% of Africa's workforce is still employed in agriculture. But the problem is we're not employed in productive agriculture. And that sort of joined up policy thinking, I think, is really lacking. Does the oil ministry in Tanzania talk to the agricultural ministry in Tanzania? Do they really do that type of joined up thinking? If you look at gas, Mozambique now has around 100 trillion cubic feet of gas. It's really shocking and surprising that already the main focus of that particular gas industry policy is LNG, exporting the gas, which also plays into what we've known as being the sort of pre-colonial configuration of the African map, where a lot of the infrastructure projects were from the hinterland to the coastal parts. So the idea that African economies have to be export-oriented, that seems to continue today, and we haven't really found the trick of how to make a lot of those resources focus and work inwards. So that's a very interesting example. How does a country like Mozambique, 100 trillion cubic feet of gas, work for the wider segment of the population? And take the example of gas. You know, the plastics that's used to make the chair that you're sitting on is made from methane, which feeds into petrochemical, which is a dry form of gas. That is one strategy you can use. Gas is also used as a feedstock for urea, which is used as fertilizer production. That's another synergy with the agricultural sector that we're seeing. But I'm not seeing these types of industrial policies emerging. And I think for me, when we talked about, you know, the Africa Rising reality and hype, that is the real trigger for me, because, you know, we have this 5 to 6% growth, which any advanced economy investor in assets or stocks would absolutely die for. But some people have argued that in order for that 5-6% growth to start to trickle down into the ordinary man on the street, that Africa would probably need to start growing at around 20% in order for us to start seeing. But then the question is, an economy that's growing at 20%, is it going to have the skills and productive base to enable that economy has inclusive growth? And these are the types of policies that I think we're lacking. If you look at East Africa, how many banks are there in Kenya? Probably like 15, 20, 30?
Number of banks in Kenya?
Yeah.
Closer to 50 now.
50,
yeah.
Now, tell me, if you have 50 banks in an economy like Kenya, and if you look at the balance sheet of each of these banks, do they actually, how much participation can they take in projects? One of the things that Nigeria did in 2005 was to consolidate the banking industry by introducing minimum capital requirements. And what that forced banks to do is to do merger and acquisition deals. So banks bought over banks, and you had the number of banks shrink from like 30 odd banks. Now I think we only have about 17 or 19 banks to put them in a better position to finance these projects. In terms of what we are doing in Nigeria, First Bank of Nigeria has been heavily involved in the oil and gas sector. In the current round of divestment, so all these oil companies are now selling assets. At least 50% of the assets are being sold. The financing is coming locally, but there's going to be a need to seek international sources of funding. That goes without saying, because you had like 6 billion go out of the industry over the last decade. So it's happening piecemeal, and we're seeing some traction.
All right. She's obviously quite passionate about this, and we could go on forever. However, Mariam is going to bite my head off, so we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Rolake, for all of your insights. It's been so fascinating. Please give her a big applause.